Welcome everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on the time zone that you are in. Welcome to this GLOBALCIT webinar on expat voting. Let me start with thanks to Jelena Jankic and Valentina Betin, who have been preparing this webinar at the EUI in Florence. I will be talking from Austria, but we will have speakers from different countries throughout the seminar. According to data published by International IDEA, which is an international organization dealing with democratic electoral assistance, out of 216 countries, only 55, so roughly a quarter, do not allow their citizens to cast votes from abroad. 124 countries have introduced external voting rights in legislative elections and 88 in presidential ones. This global trend towards an expat franchise since the 1990s demonstrates how globalization has encouraged states to transnationalize their citizenship. However, conditions for expats and temporary absentees to exercise their voting rights vary strongly across countries. Public databases like that of International IDEA or GLOBALCIT's own conditions for electoral rights dataset provide a lot of information on who is eligible to vote and how the franchise can be exercised in which type of elections. But we know still less about the politics of external voting. How, why, and by whom has it been introduced? How strongly are the so-called diasporas interested and turn out to vote? And what has been the impact of the vote from abroad on election outcomes? These are questions that are best studied by looking first in depth at particular countries before trying to test any general hypothesis for a larger number of states. This is why GLOBALCIT, the Global Citizenship Observatory, has invited 4 experts to talk about 5 countries that are in many ways starkly different. We will move from west to east. We'll start with the US, then with a comparison of France and Italy, which fit together nicely because these are early movers in terms of expat voting, and they also share a system of special representation with reserved seats in parliament for the external constituencies. Then we move on to Hungary in an Eastern European context, and finally to Turkey. So let me briefly introduce our 4 speakers. The first one is Amanda Klekowski from Koppenfels, who is teaching and researching at Kent University in Brussels. The second one is Irina Ciornei from the Barcelona Institute for International Studies. She will deal with the France and Italy comparison. And I forgot to say that Amanda will be talking about the US expat vote with a special emphasis on the forthcoming elections on November the 3rd. Szabolcs Pogonyi, who teaches at Central European University Vienna, has published an important book on kin state policies in Hungary and in Central Eastern Europe. So he will be focusing on the Central Eastern case and in particular on Hungary. And last but certainly not least, we have Bahar at the University of Coventry, who has been working on the Turkish diaspora, so the diasporas from Turkey, we should rather say, and Turkey's policies towards these diasporas. So Turkey's behavior as a kin state of a large external diaspora of migrants. Each of the 4 speakers has 15 minutes, and I will be watching the time. And after these 15 minutes, which takes us to more than a full hour, we have 30 minutes for Q&A. I would ask all of you to use the Q&A function that you find in your Zoom interface. We do it this way because we have 68 registered participants. So unfortunately, we cannot have an oral debate. So if you have a question, please click the Q&A button and write it up as briefly as possible. And do not forget to write first to which speaker your question is addressed. There is also a chat function, but that can only be used for private communication. So stick to the Q&A if you have a question. And I cannot promise that I will be able to read out all the questions and address them to the speakers, but I will do my best so that each of them gets a fair share of the questions that you ask. Without further ado, let me ask Amanda to kick it off by talking about the US elections and the expat vote.
Thank you so much, Rainer. It's a real pleasure to be here. And of course, it is just 1 week before the presidential election in the United States. At this point, more than 64 million Americans, US citizens, have already voted, and that's about half as many as in 2016. So again, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history and voting rights in the US, and then move on and talk about the more immediate question. The US sees itself still, even these days, rather as an immigration country than as an emigration country. And that really is something that then underlies much of what we see in terms of an overseas American electorate. Because the idea of an immigrant community is just not part of the US national imagination. But even so, this is a significant population. We do not have a good number of how many overseas US citizens there are. We have an estimate from the World Bank of 2.5 million and an estimate from the US State Department of 9 million. The FVIP, the Federal Voting Assistance Program of the Department of Defense, estimates that there are 5.7 million civilian citizens overseas, and that's a mid-range, and that's probably the most accurate estimate. The US is only one of 2 countries in the world, the other one being Eritrea, which taxes its citizens on global income. Not just income in the US. And that was introduced in 1962. And now, so this citizenship-based taxation, recently coined as CBT, was then used as a point of negotiation and lobbying when overseas American groups were seeking the right to vote for all US citizens living overseas. And they achieved that in 1975, and that was effective in the 1976 election. And what that did was they built in their argumentation on a right of military and dependents to vote, which was expanded in 1955, although US military were voting absentee as far back as the US Civil War. And then the other thing that they did in their lobbying was they argued no taxation without representation. And since the taxation, of course, was introduced in 1962, then that followed. So in 1976, the right that they were granted was to vote in federal elections. And so that was a presidential election, and then voting for senator and representative. And that right is on those federal elections. Now, the US, also famously known as a jus soli country, also has a limited jus sanguinis, meaning that there are US citizens who have been born abroad but have never resided in the United States. And since 1976, this has been slowly introduced that in 37 states, those born abroad and never having resided in the US can also vote. Now, so as I say, even though US citizens overseas have had the right to vote since 1976, it was really only in the year 2000, with that contested Bush-Gore election, that overseas voters received widespread attention, because of course that election was decided, and ultimately the presidency was decided with a difference of 537 votes in Florida. And the admissibility of absentee ballots in that election was really very key. And so since then, overseas voters have really managed to build on that profile and have been able to mobilize more effectively. Now, one thing that's absolutely crucial to understanding not just the overseas vote, but the American vote, the US vote altogether, is that it is a federal country, and each state administers the elections. And that's what we saw in Florida in 2000, and what we're seeing in recent judicial decisions these past days, with judicial decisions coming about from the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, coming out both on Wisconsin and on Pennsylvania. But so this then means that all overseas ballots, like domestic ballots, are counted in one of 50 states. They do not serve as a discrete constituency. And constitutionally, Peter Spiro has said that it is not possible for US citizens overseas to vote as a distinct constituency. And I think indeed, I'm obviously not a lawyer, but from my reading of it, he's absolutely right, that would require a constitutional amendment. And that is and this feeds back into this idea of the US being an immigration country and not an emigration country. And so the sort of political will for that simply would not be there. But so what this means is that when overseas ballots are counted in any one of 50 states, that then the same rules apply, meaning there are 50 different sets of rules at least. And those apply to voter registration. Until when can you register? What information do you need to register? Do you need a social security number? What do you need a witness? Well, that's more in ballot return, but voter registration and ballot return. And that's something where this constitutional and federal structure of the US really does strongly shape voting and overseas voting. And so this is, what's the registration deadline? A number of states, registration deadline isn't until 3 days from now. 12 states you can register in person. How can you return your ballot? By mail, by fax, by email. 19 states allow overseas voters to return their ballots by email or by fax. And a further 7 allow fax return. So this is incredibly complicated. And I'll get on to what that means in terms of voter mobilization and voter outreach shortly. So after that 2000 election, where it really became clear that overseas absentee ballots were important, and also crucially from a perspective of allowing citizens to exercise their right to vote, it became clear in 2000 that a number of people had not been able to exercise their right to vote. And so again, with lobbying from overseas American organizations, the 2002 Help America Vote Act included measures to support overseas voting. One of those was that overseas absentee ballots should be tabulated separately from domestic overseas absentee ballots. So overseas ballots to be separated out from domestic ballots. And what that meant, and this was absolutely crucial, is that the impact of overseas votes could be counted. And that's something that until then was very haphazard and was not, was not consistent. But after 2002, that is the case. The Electoral Assistance Commission collects that data from states and counties, albeit with incomplete reporting from states. But it is much more than we've had in the past. The 2009 MOVE Act, the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act, was specifically on overseas voting. And that had really, there were a number of elements in it, but 2 very key things: that it mandated that ballots are to be sent at least 45 days before the election, and it allows for fax or email transmission and receipt. And that's something that I'll get to, but this idea of what role can federal legislation play in voting. And that's something that is very much limited by the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution, which talks about equality, that the federal government may get involved in cases where there's concern about equality. And so coming out of the 2000 vote, and then again, the lobbying up until that point, and also various reports that came out after the 2008 election, that ballot return was the major reason, late ballot return was the major reason that overseas voters were disenfranchised. And so that's where the argument was able to be made that sending ballots at least 45 days before the election was a fair measure in order to include and to enfranchise overseas votes. So overseas ballots then being distributed against constituencies means that they can only tip very tight elections, but elections are getting tighter and tighter. In the 2016 election, at least 620,000 ballots were returned from overseas. And that's both military and civilian overseas voters, and counted in different states. And I say at least 620,000 ballots because those are the ones we know about. Those are the ones that are confirmed overseas absentee ballots as reported by the states and the local constituencies to the Electoral Assistance Commission. It could be far higher. Insofar the question, Rainer, you asked about what is turnout, we don't really have good ideas on that. The FVAP estimates 2.6 million Americans of voting age living overseas, and at least 620,000 ballots were returned in the 2016 election. And so that's something that because some people come back to the United States. It's 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, not this year, I think, but people will come back and will combine voting in person with a visit home, or they'll request a domestic absentee ballot and return that separately, feeling that might be more secure. And that's something that there is starting to be some data collected on that, but we don't yet have complete data on that. In terms of voter mobilization, Democrats abroad and Republicans abroad have both been active since 1964. Some overseas Americans could already vote then. And today, Republicans abroad no longer exists and has been replaced by Republicans overseas. Democrats abroad is the same organization since the 1960s. And so both those parties are represented overseas, but only Democrats abroad is a formal part of the party structure. And Democrats abroad has run a global primary from 2008 and sends delegates to the Democratic National Convention. And that's possible because in the federal structure, political parties are the ones who run the primaries. Their administration is often delegated to the states, but the political party itself is who runs the primary. So the Democratic Party has been able to designate overseas Democrats as a 51st state or as a virtual state. Both parties allow Guam and the US Virgin Islands to have primaries, but it's only the Democratic Party which extends this to the Democrats. The Republican Party has repeatedly declined to offer overseas Republicans the same formal inclusion. In recent years, a number of voting wizards have emerged. Democrats Abroad established its in 2008, votefromabroad.org. And they have this year been running a virtual voter help desk, a Zoom room. Now, as I noted earlier, voting assistance volunteers for overseas Americans need to be familiar with 50 different procedures. There's even a little video out there on how to fold the envelope correctly for New York State. You may have heard of the naked ballot. Pennsylvania requires an additional security envelope. If you don't send your ballot in its security envelope, then it will not be counted. And so these are things that voting assistance volunteers work on. And that's something that has really been very, very engaged this year. Overseas Americans, they do phone banking to other overseas Americans. They do phone banking back to the United States. They've been sending out postcards, putting up flyers. This voter mobilization comes around every 2 years and has been increasing. And that's something that, interestingly, this year in 2020, with everything moving virtual, that I think may actually have helped. That Democrats Abroad has been doing a number of Zoom calls with candidates. And that's been much easier than in previous years, because now politicians, even Democratic Party Chair Tom Perez, are more willing to do a Zoom call than in the past, right? Because they just shift from one Zoom call to the next, as opposed to having to set up a Zoom call in the midst of their in-person day. And so that's something that the voter outreach and the voter mobilization from abroad, that's something that is facilitated by FVAP, but it is something that the mobilization is largely coming from overseas. Having said that, many candidates have given call-outs, shout-outs to overseas Americans. Joe Biden wrote a message to Americans resident overseas, and that he used that terminology, not expats, was very significant. Bernie Sanders' older brother was a delegate for him in the 2016 Democratic National Convention, a delegate from England. He himself lives abroad. And so this is something that is very, very key. In terms of voter suppression to talk about, federal structure does open the possibility for voter exclusion. And the question is, to what extent is that de facto voter suppression, right? And that's something that's always been the case for overseas voters. For Yokava ballots, that's the overseas ballots in 2016, about 3% were rejected in the end. And that's nearly half of those because of missing the deadline, and about 1/5 of those because of problems with the signature. And the question for this election is, how political is this going to become? Will it amount to voter suppression? Or is there already voter suppression inherent in a complex absentee ballot procedure? So the FVAP's mission is to reduce the barriers to voting, but that's on a federal level. And there's a lot on the state level that they cannot mandate. In terms of voter impact, overseas ballots may have made a difference in a number of elections. And that's something that certainly they make a number of votes much closer than they otherwise would be. That this is something that if we look at the preliminary vote difference back in 2016, so when the votes were first counted on election day, and then the final vote difference, we see that overseas absentee ballots, that's a count of how many they were, they may very well have made the difference in New Hampshire. New Hampshire is only 4 electoral votes, but even so, that's one election where they could well have made a difference. And so that's something that when we look at close elections, indeed, that's a place where overseas ballots could very well make a difference. Democrats abroad claims that their ballots have made a difference in several close elections, including perhaps that of now former Senator Al Franken in Minnesota in 2008, whose vote in the Senate made the difference in passing the Affordable Care Act into law. And so this is something that, that in 2016, Florida transmitted 100,000 ballots to overseas voters. And right now that's seen as a toss-up. And recent polling is showing Biden up by 1 or 2%. So my money would be on Florida for the state to watch for overseas vote impact. And I've been given my 15-minute warning, so I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Amanda, for this very rich and detailed presentation. Everybody of us is now learning a lot about US elections, but I bet there was lots of stuff in these 15 minutes that many of you never had heard about. So thanks a lot, but we'll move on immediately to our next speaker, Irina Ciornei, and I'll ask her to start her presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Rainer. Thank you, Amanda, for this wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. And I'm going to share PowerPoint now with you. Yes, okay. The talk today focuses on external citizenship and political participation of Italian and French citizens residing abroad, as you can see from the title. And besides presenting a brief overview of the 2 expat communities, as well as the legislation that frames their political participation and representation, I will address 2 issues at the end that are the topic of a paper that I am working together with Eva Ostergal-Nielsen from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And in this paper, we use data from an original data set collected under the framework of her Migrademo ERC Consolidator grant. The questions that we are exploring is the extent to which immigrants' voting preferences are determined by the political context in the country of residence. In a previous paper on transnational turnout, we show that indeed the country of residence political regime influences immigrant turnout, with more democratic countries of residence boosting transnational turnout for immigrants coming from less democratic countries of origin. And therefore, we're asking if immigrants living in non-democratic regimes, such as autocracies or anocracies, are more likely to systematically vote for a specific party in the homeland. And also, we are asking if the political center of gravity, as scholars call it, or the ideology of the dominant party in government in the countries of residence are also determine in a way or another the voting patterns of immigrants in their countries of origin. I will discuss this in relation to French and Italian expat voters. And these 2 countries are relevant for studying the broader dynamics of political participation abroad due to several reasons, among which the fact that they have a relatively large number of citizens residing abroad and a solid battery of citizenship provisions that assures their political participation and representation. These communities are dynamic and constantly increasing in the past 10 years, especially in the Italian case, as we will see in the next slide. French expats living abroad, however, represent a small share of the electorate, around 1.7%, but they cannot be ignored, as several French newspapers headlined during the 2017 campaign, because they are almost equal to the Paris constituency. And albeit there are just a few studies on the sociological characteristics of the French immigrants, we know that they tend to be highly educated and also have important shares of entrepreneurs and professionals. In the Italian case, we witness an important increase in the number of external citizens officially registered in the Italian consular registers in the past 10 years, most likely explained by the skilled migration pushed by the recent economic crisis. Their weight in the overall electorate has also been increasing. However, this has not been necessarily translated into more political impact since their representation is constrained to the reserved seats established by the 2001 law, that is 12 deputies and 6 senators. However, in close elections, such as the one from 2006, which is also the first election where Italians abroad could cast a vote from abroad, the senators selected by Italian immigrants have been decisive in establishing a left majority in the Senate. And additionally, the abstention of the senator of the associative movement of Italians abroad also contributed to the fall of the Prodi government and the snap election in 2008. Regarding the legal framework that shapes non-resident citizens' political participation, both countries have a relatively long tenure of voting rights in the European context. French expats can participate in European elections since 1971 and in presidential elections since 1981. In the brackets is the year when the law was enacted. Also, since 2012, they can also participate in legislative elections and elect their own representatives in the lower chamber. And since 1958, they have special representation in the French Senate that has been constantly enlarged until 1982, when they passed to 12 special representatives. Italians also have special representation in both chambers, and the first election that they could participate abroad was in 2006. Both countries grant generous access to de facto voting through various modalities such as in-person, postal vote, electronic vote, and proxy vote. As you can see from this slide, France has a much broader array of voting modalities than Italy, but nonetheless, this did not necessarily affect the Italian external turnout. And also both countries do not pose cumbersome registration requirements before each election. Italian and French parties also have a long history of being present abroad, and mainstream parties such as the UMP or the Italian Democratic Party have an extensive network that penetrate most Italian and French communities respectively. However, smaller parties and more recent parties, such as the Green Party in France and also the Five Star Movement in Italy, also established a network of parties abroad, albeit they were more concentrated on specific constituencies, especially the European ones. There have been written very good studies recently on how these parties tap into the external vote and their campaign modalities. I would recommend the chapter of Tudi Kernelagen on how La République En Marche planned its election and campaigning abroad in 2017. And in the Italian case, there are very good studies by Tintori, Battison, and also Kamatari and Ostergal Nielsen in their most recent paper. However, what can we observe in terms of voting patterns? We know that French expats have traditionally been seen as supporters for the center-right, with historically massive support for what used to be the former UMP or RPR. However, the 2017 brought an important exception as regards the results of the external vote in presidential elections, because President Macron received an even larger share of the external votes than within the domestic constituencies. Likewise, in the case of the legislative elections from 2012, there was a surprising victory of left-wing candidates, which was not actually expected by the UMP politicians, were also those that pushed for the special representation and enlargement of franchise to the lower chamber of French expats. But are these voting patterns in any way influenced by the political context in the countries of residence? This graph is based on the data of the most voted party in homeland elections by country of residence, and inquires if there is a connection between the country of residence political regime, that is being an autocracy, a democracy, or an anocracy, and vote for the UMP and La République en Marche, respectively, in the last election. The classification of countries in autocracies, anocracies, or democracies is based on the Polity5 dataset. And what we see is that the UMP has been systematically more voted by the French residing in anocracies than in democracies. And it is also where the République en Marche has the least success in the 2017 elections. And one explanation that we have to test better, because we're only at doing the first draft of the paper, has to do probably with the profile of the French communities residing there. Because most likely business people and entrepreneurs represent an important part of the French living in countries classified as anocracies, such as the Russian Federation, Turkey, Egypt. But also we have important old historical French communities living in North African countries, which are also classified as anocracy by the Polity5 dataset. Another explanation that we would actually be even more interested to test, if there is a mechanism that connects anocracies and the vote for the UMP, not only through the profile of the immigrants that live there, but also through the fact that these voters may actually learn to socialize in a context that has certain authoritarian or law and order or right-wing characteristics. But that's something that we have to check better. However, we think that this question is very interesting to explore further. If, however, we want to see if there is a connection between the political center of gravity in the residence context and vote for the center right in France, for example, the picture is less clear. The political center of gravity here refers to the ideology of the dominant party in power in the country of residence during the legislature before the homeland elections take place. And it is a categorical variable that measures if the party in government is left, center, or right, based on the data set on political institutions. The analysis here does not actually show that there is a clear connection, but what we do observe is that French voters residing in countries where the political center of gravity is left were the most likely to vote for Macron rather than for Sarkozy. So signaling a possible connection between the left as center of gravity in the residence context and vote for a candidate that is basically more to the left than Sarkozy. This is data for the second round of the presidential elections in 2017. Now, going back to Italians abroad, their voting patterns have been not so aligned as the French ones, in the sense that they varied with each election. We see that massive support for the left in 2006 and close election results brought in 2008, and relative close support for the PD, the Five Star Movement, and Lega and Forza Italia in the 2018 legislative elections. Now, if we want to see if there's a connection between, for example, the country of residence political regime and the vote for the left, the Italian left, such as Democratic Party and Five Star Movement, we see that leftist parties were more likely to be voted in autocracies rather than democracies. And the reverse is true for the vote for the right in the latest Italian elections. However, there is no clear connection with, it's not really a pattern that we can distinguish here between the vote for the Democratic Party and the ideology or the center of gravity of the dominant party in government in the countries of residence. So to conclude, France and Italy are important countries to study in order to see the dynamic of the external vote abroad, because they have important expat communities and very generous legislation that grants a participation and representation rights. However, with very few exceptions, the external vote is not decisive, but could be potentially decisive, especially in close elections, as we could see in the 2006 Italian elections, and we can also imagine that in a very close presidential elections in France, they could become, in a way or another, decisive. But there's no documentation up to date that would show a decisive vote of the French expats in this case so far. However, what we do see that it is important and missing in the literature is to better unpack how the residence context influences the voting patterns of external voters in homeland elections. And France and Italy offer some evidence that there is a connection between the country of residence political regime and the political preferences in elections back home. But the evidence that we have so far is weak. And another possible explanation is that we could observe a stronger effect for immigrants coming from countries with a lower quality of democracy, and not necessarily from France and Italy, who may have very consolidated political preferences and therefore may not be so influenced by the context of residence where they reside. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Irina, for sharing these brand new data. As I understand it, you also aim to include Spain in this kind of comparative study. So we are looking forward to seeing more results. I think it was also very interesting that you are throwing out research hypotheses that have not yet been completely tested. Like what has a stronger effect on expat voting patterns? Is it the selectivity of immigration, or is it the regime characteristics of the host country? So there is stuff for new research out there, and thank you for suggesting it. Let us move on to the third speaker. This is Szabolcs Pogonyi from the Central European University.
Thank you, Rainer. Thank you, everyone. Hi, everyone. Let me first share my presentation. Okay, so today I want to talk about Hungarian non-resident voting in the context of non-resident voting in Eastern and Central Europe. As I have only 15 minutes, I will have only very brief and sweeping generalizations concerning non-resident voting patterns in East Central Europe. So in this paper, I want to look at why individual voters, non-resident voters, tend to vote for a specific party. And to gauge this, I will be using, of course, electoral data and also 51 in-depth interviews with non-resident Hungarians in the neighboring states in Israel and North America, as well as an online survey that was filled out by 880 newly naturalized Hungarians. And the survey was about non-resident citizenship, and I had a number of questions concerning external voting, non-resident voting. So in this first slide, as for the general Central European context, I collected from the Global Citizenship website the countries of the region, the post-communist space, and the availability of external voting in these countries. As you see, non-resident voting has become a standard not only in the Western European countries, but also in the new EU member states. Now, nonetheless, non-resident voting entails very different voting groups in these countries. The next slide, this is from an article that I published in 2013. I tried to overview the different normative dilemmas and practical implications, political implications of non-resident voting. And in this article, I distinguished a number of different non-resident populations that, in the case of whom non-resident voting has very different implications. In Western Europe and usually in migrant receiving countries, expatriate voting means absentee or expatriate voting. That is, most of the voters that cast their votes without being territorially resident in their homelands are either absentees who are temporarily away or expatriates who were born in their homelands but left for good, or at least have been abroad for several years. Now, as opposed to Western Europe and North America, non-resident voting in Central and Eastern Europe is to a large extent, on top of expatriates, includes a very specific group, that is kin minorities. Kin minorities, that is ethnic kin populations that were created not as a result of migration, but rather as a result of the redrawing of international borders. So in Eastern and Central Europe, as I'm sure you're all aware, we have large kin populations who have the right to vote in mostly neighboring countries where they have never lived. Now, even among these cases, Hungary is quite special because Hungary's borders have not been redrawn in the last, have not been redrawn significantly since the end of the First World War. Nonetheless, in 2010, the Orbán government, after a landslide victory, decided to offer full non-resident citizenship, including partial voting rights for ethnic Hungarians who live in the neighboring countries or anywhere in the world. As a result of these policies, by today, more than 1 million Hungarians in a country of slightly more than 9 million got citizenship without having residence in Hungary or having ever lived in the country. So these are people who never lived in the current borders of Hungary. Since 2014, non-resident Hungarians are also eligible to vote in the parliamentary elections. I won't explain in detail because this is a very complicated system, but they have basically held the vote of resident Hungarians. So let's look at the patterns. In 2014, by the parliamentary election in April, we had 550,000 non-resident Hungarians naturalized since 2010, out of whom slightly less than 200,000 were registered voters. In the April election, slightly more than 120,000 cast their vote, and 95.5% of these voters supported Fidesz, the governing party. These external votes resulted in one additional seat in the parliament, where we have 199 representatives. Although this is only one single seat, which usually has no big impact, in 2014, Fidesz had a 2/3 majority exactly with this additional seat. Without this additional seat secured by the non-resident votes, Fidesz wouldn't have had a 2/3 majority. In Hungary, the 2/3 majority enables Fidesz to rewrite the constitution basically any day. So it gives Fidesz full power. In 2018, we had obviously more recently naturalized Hungarians living beyond the borders, even more registered voters, and the turnout was also higher, nearly twice as high as 4 years before. As for the distribution of votes, in 2018, Fidesz received an even higher percentage of the total votes, 96.2% of all the votes cast outside Hungary's territory. Nonetheless, and despite the fact that the number of votes cast outside the country was significantly higher than in 2014, in the 2018 election, it made no impact whatsoever on the final distribution of seats. As a result of a highly complex distribution system, Fidesz would have received exactly the same number of seats, even without the non-resident vote. Okay, so we also have some more data. It's very difficult in the Hungarian system to distinguish proper expatriate votes, that is, votes of Hungarians not living or who left Hungary after being born here or spending here significant amount of time, from non-resident voters' preferences who have never lived in the country. One of the ways to estimate the different voting patterns of expatriates proper and non-resident kin populations is to look at the 2014 parliamentary election data, in which the vote for left-wing and parties and the Jobbik party, which in 2014 was a far-right party, was significantly higher than in the national elections, which suggests that Fidesz has a very high support among non-resident Hungarians living in the neighboring countries. So those voters who received citizenship as a result of the 2010 preferential citizenship law, while expatriate populations, expatriate voters have a more diverse, have very different preferences, and the support for left-wing and the Jobbik party is way higher among these cohorts. So what explains this? What explains that Hungarians' ethnic kin populations outside Hungary vote overwhelmingly for Fidesz? Today it may not sound very interesting because Fidesz has become a populist nationalist party, but in 2014 it was contested from the far-right Jobbik party. That is, it had an even more nationalistic, radical nationalist party on its right flank. So what explains that Hungarians outside the country still vote for Fidesz? I will skip some of the files or slides because it would take me very long. Here, I want to focus on the interviews. I selected here a sample from the interviews to the question, why do you vote, how do you vote, whether you vote, and which party you vote for. So in these interviews, in these 51 in-depth interviews, most of them were longer than an hour, so I had a lot of time to talk to my respondents. I asked about the political preferences and voting motivations of non-resident Hungarians. Let me give you some, just like a sample of the responses. As one of the respondents in Serbia said, I know it was not an obligation, but I felt that it is my duty to vote. Similarly, another respondent in Romania said, I voted for Orban to thank him for making all this possible. I felt that it is my duty to express my gratitude. Another respondent from Romania, well, Viktor Orban wanted to be nice with us so that we can get citizenship, and then in return, we can also be nice with him and vote for him. And finally, a third respondent from Romania, Transylvania, concerning voting, I agree with those who say that we should not have a say in what happens in Hungary. So I largely agree with the opposition parties who were outraged that Uncle John from secular land, who knows nothing, will have the right to vote. And then he added, well, if I have citizenship, I have a duty to participate in every election. So These responses to me illustrate, I have, of course, several other responses. I have an array of similar responses to my questions. So all this to me suggests that Hungarians in the neighboring countries voted overwhelmingly for Fidesz, not because the Fidesz party had a strong nationalist agenda, but simply because they wanted to return this gesture of giving of citizenship. They felt that they have an obligation to honor Fidesz by supporting it in the election because Fidesz gave them citizenship. It was a deal. I had respondents who had radical right-wing preferences, and in terms of ideology, they were also open about being supporters of the Jobbik party, which in 2014 was basically an irredentist party supporting territorial revision and the inclusion of the so-called lost territories of Greater Hungary into Hungary. But even these voters, along with left-leaning voters who said that they feel closer to the Hungarian left-wing parties, most of them who voted said that they voted for Fidesz nonetheless, because that was the deal. Fidesz made them an offer, a transactional deal. Fidesz offered them citizenship. So if they got Hungarian citizenship and a Hungarian passport, they have the obligation to honor this, to return this favor and vote Fidesz despite their own political preferences and views. Now, one of the biggest puzzle for us in Hungary was how come that the far right, the then far right Jobbik, is not receiving a higher share of the non-resident vote. Jobbik was extremely active in the campaign, in the election campaign, both in Romania and Serbia, where most non-resident ethnic Hungarians live. So how come that their support was extremely low? It was around 1%. Jobbik got even less support, less votes than the left-wing parties that didn't want to give citizenship for ethnic Hungarians in the first place. I won't have the time now to read all the responses, but I think the pattern is pretty straightforward. Non-resident Hungarians, even those who were in theory supportive of radical nationalist or even irredentist ideas, were not in support of Jobbik, not only because they felt that they have to return the favor of Fidesz by voting Fidesz, but also because they realized that Jobbik creates trouble for them. Jobbik is a radical right-wing party. It's too radical, too nationalist. Therefore, supporting it would be against the best interest of transborder Hungarians who, even if they were nationalists, they didn't want to have trouble with the local majorities. Okay, so what are the conclusions? The first conclusion is pretty straightforward. Ethnic outbidding didn't succeed, at least in the case of non-resident ethnic Hungarians. Ethnic Hungarians were not at all likely to support the most radical nationalist party, the party that wanted to have the so-called lost territories returned to Hungary. The most important finding is that non-resident votes can be best explained by this sense of obligation to return Fidesz's favor of offering citizenship and voting rights for non-resident Hungarians. So it was seen as a transactional obligation to honor citizenship and to vote Fidesz. And the third finding is related to the first one, that is transborder Hungarians, despite they are often targeted by radical nationalist ideas, are not really supportive of parties that endorse radical irredentist politics simply because they have a skin in their game. Okay.
Thank you very much, Szabolcs. I think this makes us really aware how important it is to be aware of differences, not just between countries and contexts, but also within the so-called expat vote. There's the absentee voters, the expat voters that really are first-generation immigrants, and the kin state minorities are very, very different groups in terms of their own biographical experiences and their relations to the country where they cast their vote. And this needs to be kept in mind. Politicians are well aware of this, so researchers should better be aware of that too. Thanks you, and without further ado, and in order not to lose too much time, we move on to the last presentation by Bahar.
Thank you.
And so please go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you so much for inviting me to this webinar and giving me the opportunity to present my work. So this is going to be a paper with Elise Ferron from University of Tampere in the future. So this is a work in progress, but I also talk about my previous articles in this one. So I'll be talking about the Turkish case and how an authoritarian government is engaging with its diaspora with a specific focus on the expatriate voting mechanisms. I want to start with an anecdote. This is a photo from President Erdogan's visit to Bosnia in May 2018, just before the elections in June. So this rally was depicted as a success story for the AKP government in Turkey for a long time, also for Erdogan's personality itself, because thousands of people attended this meeting in Sarajevo. It was an election rally. People were put into buses from different European countries, including the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, and I read somewhere it was more than 15,000 people. And the audience was shouting slogans like Erdogan the Sultan, we are with you. And this was one of the biggest successes of Erdogan's election rally. So this was also depicted as a great PR event, a fantastic example for soft power, public diplomacy, nation branding, you name it. So this was one side of the coin. But on the other side of the coin, we need to ask why this election rally took place in Bosnia rather than another country in Europe where a sizable Turkish minority reside. And the reason was that Turkey's extraterritorial election campaigns antagonized many European governments, and Turkey's transnational election campaigns were banned in countries like the Netherlands, Austria, and Germany for a variety of reasons I'll talk about in the rest of the presentation. So this was also I would consider this also a failure of Turkey's diaspora engagement policy with its aim of soft power and public diplomacy. So this pretty much summarizes Turkish experience, in my opinion. But let's go back to the main topic now. Turkey's diaspora engagement policy brought this external voting rights to Turkish diaspora, but it's part and parcel of a larger domestic and foreign policy, which aimed at using Turkish diaspora members abroad as a tool for soft power. So to use them as bridges to have leverage in politics in host countries as well. So it had a lot of motivations, including economic, political, and social ones, including tapping diaspora resources. But when it comes to reality, when we look at implementation, this policy included positive and negative engagement. So while empowering a certain segment of Turkish population, it also repressed dissidents abroad, which many people now call transnational authoritarianism. So it included aspects of diaspora diplomacy. It heavily invested in political Islam abroad among diaspora members, and external voting rights was used as one of the main pillars of the implementation of Turkey's diaspora engagement policy under the AKP government. So when we look at these rights, let me just state some facts to start with. So Turkey has been sending immigrants abroad for many, many years, so this is not something new, but in-country expatriate voting rights were only granted in 2012. Before, expats could vote at the customs or at the border, and they only received this right in 1987, and then also the right to vote in referenda in 1995. So expatriate voters make up about 5% of the Turkish electorate in the 5 consecutive midterm elections I'll talk about. Turkey has around 3 million registered voters, and the turnaround raised from 19 to 50% from 2014 to 2018, which clearly shows that the government was extremely successful in promoting these rights and convincing people to vote in the elections. And the YTB, which is the Presidency for Turks Abroad and related communities, they were really active in canvassing votes for the AKP, but also for other parties, because they can't really limit these rights. These are for everybody. So they use social media effectively. But at the same time, when it comes to using diaspora engagement institutions for expatriate voting, we see that most of the state funding was used for AKP's election campaigns abroad, while other parties were deprived from these kind of resources. So if you want to read more about the intricacies of organizing these rallies, I would recommend Inci Yener's article on top-down and bottom-up mobilizations of different political parties abroad. So there's another reason why the percentage of voter turnaround increased over time. It was because in 2014, it was the first time people were voting in country, and the state introduced an appointment system. There were very few locations. People had to travel miles and miles to go and vote, and they had to pay from their own pocket. So the voter turnaround rate was really low. In 2015, the appointment system was lifted, but people still had to vote near the consulates or embassies that, according to their registered address. And in 2007, this was also lifted, so they could vote for anywhere at any embassy or any border control area. So these kind of reforms also facilitated the process for expatriate voting. This just shows the distribution of border votes before 2012. So how many people voted at the border and the percentages. So we see that AKP's vote percentage increased gradually. HDP, the pro-Kurdish and pro-leftist party, is not in the picture for these elections, and the CHP sort of had a stable voter base. But when we look at the numbers, they are quite low, and today they are completely different. So I'm using Sevi et al.'s articles, their figures from their articles. So the last 5 elections where Turkish diaspora members exercised their right. So we see that the turnout rate is increasing from almost 19% to around 50% gradually. And we see how the AKP increased its votes, while the HDP received around 20%, but lost some votes with the 2018 election. And the CHP's percentage is usually 70%. And we also see the results of the presidential elections and the referendum. So this is basically what these 5 elections took place. For example, the 2014 one was the first presidential election. The others are parliamentary, and then early elections, referendum for the constitutional change, and then snap elections, basically. This is just a flyer that the YTB created to circulate around social media. So it says, "Turkey is stronger with you." So they use a lot of slogans to convince people to vote. They made the Turkish diaspora members feel that they are part of this polity. You know, they are part of this nation. They are not a liability to Turkey anymore. Actually, they are an asset, and they were treated badly by the previous governments, but AKP is embracing them. And this discourse really helped. So if we look at just the latest election, the 2018 parliamentary elections, we see that the voter turnout was really high, but at the same time, the party which received the majority of the votes changed depending on the country. So in countries like Germany, France, Netherlands, and Belgium, also Austria, obviously, AKP received the highest number of votes, while in the UK and in Switzerland or in Sweden, the HDP, the pro-Kurdish / leftist party, received a majority of the votes. And this is because of the profile of the Turkish diaspora members. So if you look at the CHP received the highest number of votes in the US, for example, because that's where most of the white-collar Turkish diaspora members live, while in countries where the HDP received the highest number of votes, it's where Kurds and Alevites they have a sizable majority within the Turkish diaspora, and in other countries it's the Turkish voters. So we should really have a look at which countries received the higher number of AKP votes, because these countries were the ones where we witnessed controversies. So it's Germany, France, Netherlands, and Belgium. For example, in the UK, Turkish elections hardly made the news, except international news. So they weren't really considered as a domestic issue. But only in Sweden, although the HDP got the highest number of votes, the election still became a controversial issue. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So why did the Turkish elections cause controversies? For example, I'm sure you would remember the Netherlands, Austria and Germany banned Erdogan's speeches and other election rallies in 2018. It created a diplomatic crisis because Erdogan called Dutch and German authorities as Nazi remnants, and then this created a big diplomatic crisis. And apart from that, in countries like Brussels, some meetings were also cancelled, sometimes with excuses, sometimes openly. The Turkish politicians were barred from speaking to a large crowd. So I tried to analyze these things under 4 headings, but I think all of them come to the same issue, which is I found in a discursive analysis, it's democracy and loyalty. So the Turkish authorities were saying it's Turkish diasporans' democratic right to vote, to cast their votes abroad, and they need to be informed about the election campaigns and the programs of political parties. So Turkish political parties should be given the democratic right to hold these rallies. At the same time, in the European context, we see that many people were referring to the fact that Turkish diaspora vote would be contributing to an undemocratic government in the homeland, and everybody was talking about the values, whether Turkish voters fit into the category of those who are integrated into European values, or the Turkish side were talking about human rights and democratic rights of Turkish citizens to vote abroad. So, for example, when it comes to support for authoritarian regimes, many European politicians made declarations regarding to that, and they were very disappointed, quote unquote, that Turkish immigrants who lived in liberal democracies for so long were still sending undemocratic remittances back home. And there were some declarations by far-right parties in the Netherlands and in Austria saying that those people who vote for the AKP should go back to Turkey, they don't belong to Europe, they are not integrated enough into European values, etc. So I think the Freedom Party from Austria was the most famous one with this kind of declarations. The second concern that the European policymakers revealed was the spillover of homeland conflicts. So Turkey's domestic problems were suddenly again in the midst of European public space, and they were considered as a threat to public order. So, for example, in 2017, just about the referendum elections, so there were clashes in front of the Turkish embassy in Rotterdam and in other places in Brussels, and the prime minister made a declaration saying that there is zero tolerance for Turkey's spillover conflicts. So they also used this excuse to bar the Turkish election campaigns. Also, the issue came to the same old debate about the loyalties. You know, how can Turkish people who are like, sympathizers of Erdogan can also belong to Europe and have loyalties for Germany or Austria or the Netherlands as well. And this created a lot of debate, especially, for example, in Austria, dual citizenship then became an issue, and the Austrian authorities started an investigation because Turkish diaspora members need to denounce their Turkish citizenship in order to acquire Austrian citizenship. And then there were some fraud-related issues, and they were investigated. So they investigated, I think, in total 4,000 cases right after the elections. It just sparked this kind of debates. Also, another issue was political Islam and radicalization. So during the election campaigns, it was a well-known fact that many Turkish diaspora members were voting conservative at home and voting for social democrats abroad. But these election results were a great evidence for European politicians to talk about unintegratable Turks, and especially far right really took this case. And there was skepticism about Turkey's intentions by instrumentalizing political Islam and even radicalization in European public space by using the diaspora engagement policy and elections as a tool. For example, in Austria, 7 mosques were closed, and also, as I mentioned at the beginning, transnational authoritarianism became a big issue, which came about with the elections. And in Germany, many imams were accused of spying on Turkish dissidents. So the elections sparked this kind of debates, and it's still going on. So to conclude, I'll just leave with 4 questions, because we still need to talk about these things when we talk about Turkey's extraterritorial election campaign. So most of the attention was on the people who voted for the AKP, which was around 50%. But we need to take into account that the voter turnout was only 50%. So the rest of the people who did not vote, what do they think? Do we consider them as integrated into European values, or is there a reason why they did not vote at all? And what about the dissidents who voted for other parties? We need to talk about those as well. And secondly, are diaspora members passive receivers of AKP policies abroad? So they're like sponges taking all the AKP propaganda? No, it's extraterritorial voting rights were given because Turkish civil society in Europe lobbied for this for a long time, and people sometimes make rational choices towards voting for authoritarian governments. And thirdly, who is empowered by these? Are these the diaspora members who get this expatriate voting rights and they feel empowered, or is it Turkey using those populations to come us more votes, especially for the AKP regime, or is it the far right in European countries who are benefiting from these ordeal? Finally, this also shows that there are limits for diaspora engagement policies, for state-led policies for host countries. So we all celebrated this neoliberal trend that there are diaspora ministries and all states are forming diaspora engagement policies, but it's not about votes only, and it's not about migration, but it's also about sovereignty. So when do the host countries draw the line? And I leave with these questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bahar. It's absolutely fascinating to compare also the last 2 cases, Hungary and Turkey, 2 democracies with increasingly authoritarian governments, where incumbents quite successfully strategically use the external vote. But it's also important to see the differences. You know, with Turkish diaspora being largely made up of labor migrants in their origins, and leading to a heavy backlash in the host country that is absent in the Hungarian case. So without further commenting on these 4 excellent presentations, I want to thank the speakers. And now it's my task to pose some of the questions that have been raised in the Q&A to each of the speakers. I have so far 8 questions. I will not take them all up. I will ask each speaker 2 questions. And I'll do this in one go and let you then answer as briefly as possible so that everybody can still talk. I don't have a question for Bahar yet in the Q&A, but it might come up as we address the other ones. So let me start with Amanda. The first question is from Rui Ziegler. a longtime collaborator also of GLOBALCIT, and he asks, given the divergent federal structure that you have described and the divergent significance of voting in red, blue, and contested states, A, to what extent can non-residents alter the state in which they are eligible to vote? B, what criteria are applied to determine eligibility when individuals have links to more than one state? And C, who decides the latter? And I take a second question from Marie-Lise Jacobsen, who has raised questions to several speakers. So I take this one. How do independents abroad get their ballots? Amanda, floor is yours.
Thank you. Those are, so it's a relatively easy answer, which is that you register to vote in the place you last resided in the United States. In the case of children born abroad who've never resided in the United States, they request their ballot from the place where a parent last resided. I can also supplement that with a personal story. My two children, who are twins, are voting in their first election this year, and they duly sent in their absentee ballot. The town clerk responded and said, "You're not eligible to vote." So we, with the help of the Democrats Abroad Voter Help Desk, then sent back the relevant paragraph of the law, which said, actually, yes, they do have the right to vote. And so then they were said, oh, yes, absolutely, of course, you have that right. So people do not change. They remain at the last place where they resided. Independents abroad, that is simply, it doesn't matter your party affiliation. For the general election, you request that ballot at your place of last residence. But indeed, for the primary, only the Democrats, only registered Democrats may vote in a party primary outside of the United States. Republicans and independents, again, would vote in a primary in their last place of residence.
Thank you for also being very succinct in your answers. So let me move on to two questions to Irina. The first one is from Kasper. Okay, sorry, I have to move up again. From Kasper Zulecki from Oslo. And he asks, how many votes are cast by French expats in autocratic countries like Russia, Turkey, etc.? Assuming that the number is relatively small and that it is rather a specific demographic group, how do you deal with this in your analysis in terms of establishing host regime causality? And I take a second question here from Martin Fink, co-director of GLOBALCIT and now chair in citizenship studies at the EUI. Question to Irina, very interesting presentation with some intriguing hypotheses. However, I'm not sure why you expect an effect of regime characteristic or party in government on voting patterns among expat voters. I could expect a possible effect of living in an autocracy on turnout, e.g. concerns about political participation abroad. But I'm not sure why this would affect party choice, unless you would include possible specific foreign policies of parties vis-a-vis specific regimes. But then you would need to measure both foreign policies and turnout at a dyadic level, which is between combinations of origin and destination countries. Irina, can you pick up these two?
Yes. Thank you very much for these questions. So regarding the first question, I can't really give numbers right now. I briefly tried to look in the data set, but what I would like to say is that the numbers of French expats living in anocracies is not necessarily very low, especially in North Africa, where there are historic French communities of expats such as Tunisia, Morocco, etc. It is true that in other anocracies where we don't have this component, such as Russia or Turkey, the numbers are indeed lower. But the idea is to see how, let's say, what does the majority of these residents in these countries actually vote for. So I do not necessarily see a problem in the low numbers. It could be a problem because maybe the community is not so diverse, so it tends to be more concentrated, especially for expats living in anocracies where they don't have this historical links. But I do not think it is a problem from a statistical point of view necessarily, since we're working with percentages here and the most voted party per country of residence, so to say. I don't know, I'm open to more comments that would really help me, but immediately I don't see why this should be a problem, since these are basically percentages and not numbers. And regarding the second question, it's a very, very interesting one, and it actually gives us ideas on how to improve the model. But actually let's say the hypothesis that the connection between party trace in homeland election and the political regime or the political center of gravity in the residence context is primarily informed by the resocialization hypothesis, as Marie-Lise, I see that she actually asked in her question, which basically states that by living in a specific context, immigrants are also influenced in how they mobilize, and also the extent to which they mobilize, but also what they vote for. And there are some studies that focus on specific countries that dispute, confirm, or rather reject this hypothesis. There are two studies. One is on Ukraine, and then there's another one, I think, on Tunisia, that basically give contradictory finding regarding this hypothesis. So what we're basically trying to do here is to settle in this debate and see if there is an influence of the place where migrants live on their party preferences, not only on the tools and skills that they learn in order to participate politically in their country of origin. And regarding the connection between the party policy towards those specific regime, that is actually a very interesting suggestion that we should definitely look at. I think it is very hard to have a look at it with a broad number of residence countries or with a broad number of origin countries, but maybe that would be a point to look at specific countries such as France or Italy, where we have comprehensive data on the campaigning of these parties abroad and on their political program towards expats, and see if actually there are mentions of this country of residence political regimes and if they are connected to that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Irina. Moving on to Szabolcs. I start with another question from Marie-Lise. Thanks, by the way, Irina, for picking up her question and your answer anyhow. So her question is the kind of clientelist approach towards citizenship and voting more generally typical of Hungarian voters, so including the domestic ones, or is it particular to the diaspora? And is there any linkage between being informed about politics back in Hungary and this clientelistic justification? And I also have a second question to Szabolcs from Kasper Zulecki. You mentioned that the kin voting phenomenon is widespread in Central Eastern Europe, but where is it actually present apart from Hungary? Isn't Hungary the only country in the region that granted citizenship and voting rights to foreign-born ethnic nationals?
Okay, thank you for the questions. I'll be brief. Concerning the barrel pork politics, well, obviously, it's very difficult to determine what actually motivates individuals within the country to vote. My guess would be probably even more general. That is, people tend to vote for parties that make them offers. That's not very unique. What is really unique in the case of the Hungarian case is that they got something, and then even those people who didn't agree with this sort of favor and present voted Fidesz despite their own political views. And that was, to me, something that is really striking. As for the other cases, as for Kasper's question, other cases, well, obviously we have similar cases. Croatia is another important case where non-resident ethnic kin voters had a huge influence on electoral outcomes. Another example would be Romania, Like in the case of Romania, the Romanian governing party just established offices in Moldova with the explicit hope of getting the votes of Romanian citizens in Moldova who got citizenship as ethnic Romanians through a legislation that was very similar to the Orban government's legislation. So this is not at all a unique case, but I fully agree that Hungary is special in the sense that this is the country where we have the largest non-resident voting body in Eastern and Central Europe.
Thank you. Finally, we have now also two questions to Bahar. And the last one actually is addressed to all participants. So maybe you have a last shot, if Bahar is brief in her answer, to address that question too. I start with Joachim Platter's question to Bahar. In Hungary, we witness strategies of electoral engineering, discriminating migrants compared to kin minorities in neighboring countries. Do we see a similar strategy of the Turkish government, e.g. in attempts to suppress Kurdish votes from abroad?
Thank you for the question. Oh, the second one is...
No, go ahead. I'll ask the last question after your response.
Okay, because you said it's general.
Yes, indeed, you're right.
Oh, thank you for the question. I would just start with saying that I think when AKP came up with this policy of extending voting rights to the Turkish diaspora, they didn't have in mind that the pro-Kurdish party would participate in the elections as a party, because before they were having independent candidates in different parts of Turkey, mostly in where the majority of Kurds live, and they didn't participate because of the 10% threshold. But the HDP entered into the political scene, and then we saw its gradual rise and finally passing the threshold, and it changed the calculations a little bit. But in the beginning, I think the idea was to compete with the CHP, which was very easy to defeat in the diaspora because of the voting tendencies of the participants. But when it comes to specific policies to repress it, I remember from the first election experiences, for example, in Sweden, where it was obvious that Kurdish votes would be more than conservative votes. The voting day was only 1 day, and while in Germany and other countries it was 3-4 days, or even extended to 5 days. And it was only in Stockholm, for example, it was very hard for people to travel from Malmö and other places, and Kurds protested and perceived this as a policy against their voting rights. But when it comes to specific policies, I would say the elections were not fair and democratic, I think, in Turkey. And this was also real in the diaspora. They did not have the same financial or non-material resources to do campaigning at the same level with the AKP, because all the civil society organizations that are led by the AKP and the other diaspora organizations which were formed under this new diaspora policy had received a lot of money from the state, and they basically did all the campaigning, while the Kurdish or other political parties had to have their own funds to do that, and this created a very visible imbalance. And also many Kurds who live in the diaspora, especially after the 80s, left for a reason. Many of them denounced their Turkish citizenship, so they didn't have the right to vote. And if they had, some of them had pending trials back in Turkey, so they couldn't go to the consulate and register their address, for example. So without a registered address to the consulate, they can't vote. And many dissidents after the coup attempt in Turkey also suffer from this. If the consulate doesn't accept their demands, and they even afraid of being arrested, etc. So they just don't want to do these bureaucratic things, and voting is one of those things. They don't want to go to the embassy. So apart from that, I would just say, so the HDP's organization was pretty bottom up, so it wasn't as transnational as the AKP campaign. So I think these all in all affected the results in the diaspora as well, but there was no specific engineering as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, Bahar. So we are nearly going into overtime, but I think the last question deserves a quick and short answer from each of the speakers, and then we conclude. So that question is from Dilek Çınar, who teaches at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. and it's a normative one. Feel free to duck it if you are uncomfortable with answering normative questions. How many generations should expats be given the right to vote from abroad? So most countries have used sanguineous transmission of citizenship for subsequent generations born abroad, assuming that many generations keep their citizenship of the country of origin of their parents or ancestors. How many generations should have the right to vote? I start with Amanda.
Thanks, Rainer, and thanks for the question. I mean, I'll refer this one right back to Rainer. I mean, the stakeholder approach is, of course, the one that I tend to think makes the most sense. And in that case, as Rainer's also said, that in the United States, it's an easy case, that as long as there's taxation on US citizens, then of course they should also have the right to vote. And I mean, legally for the United States, that it can go into multiple generations, but only if one US parent has lived in the United States for at least, so for a child born abroad to an American citizen born abroad, that parent must have lived in the United States for at least 5 years, 3 of which after the age of 14. So if somebody continues to go back to the United States for, say, for college and for a year afterward, and then goes back overseas, and that keeps repeating, it can go on forever. But citizenship taxation also goes on forever. And I'm just going to quickly pick up on a question that Martin asked about the FATCA, the tax registration and the bank registration. And that's something that was an Obama era law, and the Republicans overseas as a single issue organization with the goal of overturning that. And that's something that heavily affects Republican voting, but they were going to be voting against Democratic candidates anyway. And the Democrats, it's not a key factor in their voting. That the partisan divide remains much stronger, and that the FATCA law is something that overseas Democrats will groan about, but for the most part, it's not going to affect their voting. So thanks, and thank you for both.
Thanks, Amanda. Irina, same question, but if you can, please a short answer. 1, 2, 3, or all would be good.
Okay, yeah, because I also think that you should actually answer this question, because yes, I think that I would definitely refer to your framework, as Amanda said, and I think that to defend external voting rights beyond the first generation is rather a difficult task for a normative thinker, but maybe we can envisage situations like Amanda says, that the second generation goes back to study or shows some sort of connection, that maybe indeed then we could think of also political participation rights. But my short answer is not more than the first generation.
Szabolcs.
Yeah, I have very little to add to this. We need to be flexible. You may have differentiated voting rights, that is, non-residents may vote for president, but not in other elections. And also, like, unless there is a huge impact, you know, ain't broke, don't fix it. So if there are no large non-resident voting populations, you can leave things as they are. I know it's not a very philosophical answer, but yeah.
But a very clear one. Bahar. Bahar, are you still there?
No matter what we do now, home states are defining who is going to vote. And for example, in the case of Turkey, they're even trying to rekindle the ethnic identity of the 4th, 5th generations, and the Turkish state is trying to turn them into voters. So this is like, in practice, it's a different thing. But I agree with the others. After the first generation, it's hard to defend this position. But at the same time, if it doesn't make so much difference, then you know, I think with generations the voter turnaround rate drops anyways. So maybe after the first one, it should be just left as it is.
Thanks to all of you, also for this broad consensus which seems to have emerged on the last question, and for a very rich set of presentations. I also want to thank again Jelena Jankic and Valentina Betin for hosting this seminar and running it so well in terms of the logistics. And finally, let me announce that this was the second webinar in a series of GLOBALCIT webinars on different topics. And I want to announce the next one in the series, which will be on citizenship and populism. And that will be on the 24th of November, again at 6 p.m. I hope you will participate again, and goodbye to everybody.